Welcome to the Timeline Podcast, where we will be discussing how the liberation of blacks after 1877 gave way to legal segregation in the South. Leading up to the end of the war, two major amendments were created to grant blacks more political rights and equality. The 14th Amendment, which gave all U.S.-born people citizenship regardless of their race, and the 15th Amendment, which gave men of age the right to vote regardless of their race, made Southerners mad because it increased black political power. After the Civil War, most Southern states passed laws to restrict black people's rights that were gained from the war. These laws were named Jim Crow laws, based on the derogatory term for black men that was started in 1877. These laws overturned the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited racial segregation in public facilities. Redeemers were a combination of merchants, planters, and business entrepreneurs. They dominated Southern politics after 1877 and claimed to have redeemed the region from the horrors of misgovernment and black rule. They wanted to undo as much of Reconstruction as possible. They slashed state budgets, taxes, especially taxes on land property that were reduced, and they closed hospitals.
Black schools suffered heavily, and funding between black and white schools widened. After the Civil War, educating African Americans wasn't a priority. Early education usually occurred in churches, and black high schools were almost extinct in the South. New laws in the South allowed arrest of virtually anyone without unemployment, and penalties for petty crimes were heavily increased. This led the Southern prison population to increase heavily, and a majority of this population was black. Black farmers suffered the most. The Upper South had some economic opportunities through new industrial jobs like miners and tobacco factories, which employed blacks. A good number of blacks managed to get land and took up self-sufficient farming. However, in the Deep South, blacks owned a smaller percentage of land than they did at the end of Reconstruction. New institutions like colleges, churches, businesses, and women's clubs were a foundation for new black urban communities. This created the addition of a black middle class, mostly teachers, physicians, businessmen, who served mainly black customers. However, the labor market was heavily divided on racial lines. Black men were excluded from supervisory positions in factories, and white-collar jobs weren't options for the black communities. Black women mainly worked as domestic servants and couldn't find employment as secretaries and store clerks. An estimated 40,000 to 60,000 blacks migrated to Kansas wanting political equality, freedom from violence, access to education, and economic opportunity. These migrants were given the name Exodus after the biblical account of the Jews escaping Egypt. However, most blacks had little options but to stay in the South. Northern job expansions mainly refused to hire blacks in the new industrial economy. These jobs wouldn't really be offered to blacks until World War I. Blacks continued to cast ballots in large numbers, and a few blacks served in Congress. But not until the 1990s would the number of black legislators in the South be similar to the amount during Reconstruction. Political leadership was passed to black women. Women's groups were created like the National Association of Colored Women. These clubs pressed for women's rights and racial uplift. They aided poor families and battled gambling and drinking in black communities. The women reformers challenged the racial ideology that restricted all blacks to the idea of degraded second-class citizens. For nearly a generation after Reconstruction, black Southerners continued to cast ballots, and in some Southern states, the Republican Party stayed strong. The threat of biracial, political, and interracial allegiance frightened Democrats in power. Between 1890 and 1906, every Southern state created laws or altered their constitutions to eliminate the black vote. Southern legislators drafted laws that seemed to ignore racial differences, but were designed to eliminate black vote and avoid controversy from the 15th Amendment. The most popular was a poll tax. This was a fee citizens had to pay in order to vote, and they also did literacy tests. Some Southern states adopted a grandfather clause, which exempted them from the new requirements descendants of people eligible to vote before the Civil War. This clause invalidated laws violating the 15th Amendment. Some white political leaders presented disenfranchisement, which deprived some states the right to vote, as a good government plan, with goals of creating a better government. This idea wanted to purify politics by ending the fraud seen by Republicans and populists. Democrats continuously raised the threat of black domination in politics to justify denying blacks the right to vote. Disenfranchisement led to a generation of Southern demagogues who mobilized white voters by appeals to racism, and as late as 1940, only 3% of adult black Southerners registered to vote. Along with disenfranchisement, the late 1800s saw an increase in segregation in the South, and laws requiring the separation of races became common. Although schools had previously been segregated during Reconstruction, railroads, theaters, hotels also began to segregate or exclude blacks altogether. In 1883, in the civil rights cases, the Supreme Court invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1875 by allowing racial discrimination in public facilities. Laws mandating racial segregation became part of every aspect of Southern life. By 1900, no public high school for blacks existed in the South, and black elementary schools had horrendous conditions. The point wasn't really to separate the races, it was to make sure that when the races came in contact with each other, whites had domination. Most violence against African Americans wasn't intended for murder. It was mainly a way for Southerners to get their labor back. New social etiquette developed with behavior differentiated by race. Blacks who challenged the new social norms faced overwhelming legal and political power. They also faced the threat of violent consequences. Between 1883 and 1905, more than 50 people were lynched in the South, a majority being black men. By the mid-20th century, the total number of victims since 1880 was 5,000. Although some lynchings were secret, others were advertised in newspapers and grew large white crowds. Many victims of lynchings were accused of raping white women. Many white Southerners prided themselves on protecting the purity of white women and used this as an excuse to justify violence against black men. Most lynchings were based on petty crimes, but the biggest was looking at or associating with white women. However, most lynching victims were political leaders and activists, and although men were the most common, black women were also lynched. This gave African Americans even less social status and drove them further into poverty and more endangered. Thank you for listening.